January 14th, 1944. 0703 hours, over the Solomon Sea. Salt spray hangs in the humid morning air as a formation of Japanese A6M Zeros cuts low across the water, their engines humming in tight unison. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Nishida of the 253rd Kokutai, spots an unfamiliar silhouette climbing sharply from the east. He squints. Bent wings? At first glance, the aircraft looks almost comical, like some mishandled sketch brought accidentally to life. The Zeros tighten formation. Nishida clicks his tongue. Whatever that strange American design is, it certainly doesn't look agile. The men in Raboul's ready rooms had laughed about it for months. Rumors described a new U.S. Navy fighter so poorly shaped it struggled to land on carriers. One pilot joked it looked like a bird that had crashed into a wall and never recovered. Another swore the Americans had finally gone mad, building fighters with wings that drooped rather than soared. 0704 hours. The strange aircraft holds its climb. Its massive propeller churns the air like a circular saw. Sunlight flashes off a cockpit canopy pulled tight around a Marine Corps pilot who has already spotted the incoming Zeros. For a moment, the air goes quiet. Then, the Corsair drops. The inverted gull wings slice downward in a controlled predatory dive. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roars to life, a metallic thunder that ripples across the water. Nishida's smile fades. The American fighter begins turning, hard, much harder than the Zeros expect. Its nose swings inside their circle, a maneuver that should have been impossible for such a heavy machine. Present tense freezes the moment. Gun ports flare. Shell casings glitter. A Zero's engine erupts in smoke. Seconds later, the narrative shifts back into the past. The Corsair had been mocked for months across Japanese airfields, dismissed as a clumsy brute. Yet at sea level, in the thick, oxygen-rich air of the Pacific, those awkward bent wings produced a grip and lift profile the Zero could not match. What looked foolish in photographs had become lethal in motion. By the time the surviving pilots realized the truth, it was too late. The fighter they laughed at had just rewritten the rules of low-altitude combat. The fighter that descended on the Zeros that January morning did not emerge from a vacuum. Its creation reflected a complex web of industrial ambition, internal Navy politics, engineering gambles, and the brutal strategic realities of the Pacific War. To understand why the Corsair's inverted gull wing design stunned Japanese aviators, we must go back to 1938, when the U.S. Navy issued a new requirement: an aircraft capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour, carrying heavy armament and climbing faster than any fighter then in service. This would be a tall order in any era. In 1938, it bordered on the extraordinary. The engineers who aimed higher than anyone thought possible leading the project at Chance Vought Aircraft was the company's chief engineer, Rex Beisel, a man known for pushing beyond conventional limits. Beisel believed the project demanded a radical approach, an aircraft built around the most powerful engine the United States could field. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower monster far larger than most airframes could safely handle. Mounting such a massive engine posed two immediate problems. Propeller size. The engine required an enormous 13-foot propeller to convert its power into thrust. Landing gear length. Longer landing gear were needed to keep that oversized propeller from striking the deck during takeoff. But long landing gear meant fragility, and fragility meant disaster on a carrier. Beisel's solution, an inverted gull wing that allowed shorter, stronger landing gear, seemed bizarre, even humorous to outside observers. Yet it solved every major engineering challenge simultaneously. Propeller clearance, lift generation, and aerodynamic efficiency at high speeds. Early doubts and institutional resistance. Despite its innovation, early Navy trials in 1940-41 revealed troubling issues. Pilots complained of brutal stall behavior, a vicious bounce on landing, poor deck handling restricted forward visibility. Lieutenant Commander Boone Guyton, one of Vaught's chief test pilots, noted bluntly that the Corsair was a fighter that demanded respect before it gave loyalty. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics agreed and rejected it for carrier operations. In late 1942, the Corsair was relegated primarily to land-based Marine Corps squadrons. Japanese intelligence officers heard these reports. Some circulated them gleefully. Others dismissed the Corsair as another American over-engineered curiosity, heavy, awkward, and unfit for the carrier decks of the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Zero's early dominance. Japan's A6M0, designed by Jiro Horikoshi, had already earned a fearsome reputation. Fast, maneuverable, and astonishingly lightweight, it used its agility and long range to dominate the early months of the war. Between 1941 and mid-1942, Zero pilots consistently outturned and outclimbed most American fighters. Many Zero aces, even veteran figures like Saburo Sakai, believed that no heavy American aircraft could ever match the Zero's low-speed turning radius. This confidence hardened into complacency by late 1943, as Japan struggled to replace its veteran pilots while American industry flooded the Pacific with newer, tougher aircraft. The Marine Corps' gamble. When the U.S. Navy hesitated, the U.S. Marine Corps made a decisive gamble. Operating from rough airstrips rather than carriers, Marine squadrons believed they could master the Corsair's difficult tendencies and unlock its full potential. Throughout 1943, pilots from VMF 124, VMF 213, and VMF 214 worked relentlessly to solve the aircraft's quirks. They discovered, at sea level, the inverted gull wing created exceptional lift. The massive engine delivered unmatched acceleration in the first seconds of a dogfight. Its rugged airframe absorbed punishment the Zero could never survive. Marine pilots also realized something Japanese commanders had not. When flown aggressively at low altitude, the Corsair could outturn the Zero. This revelation was not immediately publicized. Commanders recognized its value and quietly embedded it into tactical training, beginning in late 1943. Japan underestimated the threat. By the beginning of 1944, Japanese pilots were still mocking the Corsair's odd wing shape and bulky frame. Technical reports categorized it as overweight, inflexible during turn combat, too slow in its initial roll rate. But those assessments were based on limited early encounters. They did not reflect the aircraft's evolution or the rapidly improving skill of the Marine and Navy pilots now flying it. And so, when Lieutenant Saburo Nishida and his formation approached that unfamiliar silhouette above the Solomon Sea, they did so with confidence. Confidence built on outdated assumptions and flawed intelligence. They would learn, within minutes, how much the Pacific War had changed since 1942. The transformation that turned the F4U Corsair from a mocked experiment into a decisive Pacific predator did not happen overnight. It unfolded through a chain of hidden decisions, quiet technical breakthroughs, bitter arguments inside the U.S. Navy, and a series of deadly encounters that forced both sides to rethink what they believed they knew about air combat. To understand that morning over the Solomon Sea, we must trace the events leading to it. Events shaped in briefing rooms, test ranges, and the cramped cockpits of men who pushed the new fighter to its limits. A fighter that almost failed. By early 1943, the Corsair program stood at a crossroads. The Navy still refused to deploy it on carriers. Engineers at Chance Vought feared the aircraft's future lay in obscurity. Yet in the offices of the Bureau of Aeronautics, a debate raged, one rarely spoken of in public. Minutes from a February 1943 meeting quoted one senior officer as saying, "We cannot put a plane on our carriers that behaves like a wild animal." Another countered, "But gentlemen, this is the only fighter in development that promises parity or superiority over the Zero." The internal conflict revealed a deeper tension. Should the Navy invest in perfecting the Corsair or pivot fully toward the more forgiving Grumman F6F Hellcat? Ultimately, the bureaucratic stalemate pushed the Marine Corps to step in. The Marines rewrite the rules at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, and later at Bougainville. The Marine Corps began a quiet revolution. Marine aviators had a long tradition of adapting to hardware others dismissed. They believed the Corsair's raw power outweighed its early flaws, and they were determined to prove it. The key turning points came in 3 steps. 1. Solving the landing problem. Marine squadrons did not need carrier decks, and their rough airstrips ironically helped. Pilots learned that a slightly curved approach, rather than a straight glide, gave a clearer view over the Corsair's long nose. This technique spread quickly. In one squadron briefing, Captain Jim Hill of VMF 213 remarked, "Treat her gently, and she'll punish you. Treat her like a fighter, and she'll show you things you've never seen." 2. Discovering the turn. Pilots gradually realized that the Corsair's massive flaps, long wings, and explosive low-altitude power curve allowed it to perform a surprising maneuver. A sustained hard turn at sea level with minimal energy bleed. Major Greg "Pappy" Boyington, already a legend, was among the first to understand this fully. After a test dogfight, he reportedly slammed his cockpit canopy open and shouted, "This thing will turn with a 0, if you know how to ask it." 3. Weaponizing the armor. Unlike the Zero, which sacrificed protection for maneuverability, the Corsair was built like a shield. Marine pilots learned to exploit this. They dove through enemy formations. They took hits deliberately if it meant securing a firing angle. They carried enough .50 caliber ammunition to sustain long bursts. Boyington summarized it bluntly in a late 1943 memo. "They can hit us. We can hit them harder." 3. Japan misreads the data. While the Marines refined their tactics, Japanese intelligence reports painted an increasingly distorted picture. After limited encounters in early 1943, analysts concluded the Corsair was too heavy to dogfight, too unstable at low speeds, susceptible to stalling in hard turns, poor in vertical maneuvers, unproven in combat. These impressions were fed by 3 factors: early U.S. pilot inexperience, incomplete technical reports, overconfidence in the Zero's legacy. A JNAF briefing from Rabaul at the time included a telling line: "The new American gull-wing fighter is of unconventional design and cannot challenge the Zero in a turning contest." This assumption would soon prove devastating. 4. The turning experiments. Back at Bougainville, Marine test flights revealed something extraordinary. Scenario: December 9, 1943, 11 days before the battle. 2 Corsairs from VMF 214 engaged in controlled mock duels at 500-1,000 feet. Lieutenant Bob McClurg recalled, "I tightened the turn expecting the usual buffet. It never came. The wing held. The lift held. Suddenly, I was inside the circle." Engineers initially believed the inverted gull wing improved aerodynamics, primarily during high-speed flight. But these experiments exposed a different truth. The downward angle reduced interference drag at the wing root. The configuration created additional lift during horizontal turns. The shorter landing gear reduced weight and improved response. In effect, the Corsair's strangest feature became its greatest secret weapon. The hidden briefings. In late December 1943, formal changes to Corsair combat training were quietly introduced. Marine pilots were instructed, engage at sea level. The Corsair's lift and acceleration dramatically improved below 1,000 feet. Use flaps in combat. A radical technique, 3 to 5 degrees of flaps, allowed tight turns without stalling. Force the Zero downward. The Japanese fighter lost much of its turning advantage in dense air. Climb aggressively after the first pass. The Zero could not match the Corsair's vertical acceleration. A classified training bulletin stated, "A controlled turn at low altitude can be used to defeat the Zero's principal advantage." Only a handful of officers fully understood the implications. The American fighter, once mocked for its awkward wings, was about to reverse a decade-old assumption about air combat. 6. The day before the encounter. January 13th, 1944. Fighter strip number 1, Bougainville. The night was thick with humidity as pilots of VMF 214 and VMF 223 gathered for a joint briefing. Intelligence indicated increased Japanese reconnaissance flights originating from Rabaul. Commanders ordered aggressive interception. One Marine captain summarized the mission bluntly. "If they come low, we own them." Among the men listening was First Lieutenant Harold Mitchell, who had spent 2 weeks training younger pilots on the low-altitude turn technique. He reminded them, "Don't fear the zero circle. Fear losing your energy. Keep your nose in it, and the lift will carry you." Unbeknownst to them, across the water at Rabaul, Japanese pilots were receiving their own briefing. Lieutenant Saburo Nishida's unit, the 253rd Air Group, was warned of increased American fighter patrols. Their officers told them the same familiar refrain. "The F4U remains heavy and slow in the turn. You will outmaneuver it easily." No mention was made of the Americans' new tactics. No updates were given on Marine performance. No acknowledgement that the aircraft had improved since early 1943. The stage was set for a catastrophic intelligence failure. 7. Dawn over the Pacific, January 14th, 1944, 06:45 hours, Solomon Sea. A Marine Corsair patrol lifted off from Bougainville, engines thundering through the gray dawn. The squadron flew low, skimming above the ocean surface. The ops order was clear. Patrol the gap between Bougainville and New Britain. Intercept any Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and avoid climbing above 2,000 feet unless absolutely necessary. The air was dense and warm, the perfect environment for the Corsair's unexpected strengths. 9 minutes later, Nishida's Zero formation left Rabaul, heading southeast. Their mission? Probe Allied lines, gather data, and return before American fighters located them. The two groups were flying toward the same patch of sky. V8. First contact, 0702 hours. A Corsair flight leader spotted specks approaching from the northwest. The silhouette was unmistakable. Japanese Zeros in a loose four-ship formation, descending gradually toward the patrol line. The Marines tightened up. Their leader radioed, "Keep it low. We'll bait them down." Seconds later, the Zeros saw the Corsairs. Nishida misread the situation immediately. He believed the Americans were trying to climb into a turning contest, a fatal assumption. He signaled his men to continue descending. Now the stage was perfectly set. Both formations were dropping towards sea level. Both commanders believed they held the advantage. One of them was disastrously wrong. Inc. Countdown to the breaking point, 0703:30. The Corsairs leveled off at 800 feet. 0703:40, the Zeros committed to the engagement. 0703:45. Marine pilots lowered 5 degrees of combat flaps. 0703:50. Engines roared as the Americans accelerated. 0703:55. Nishida initiated the turn he believed would trap the Corsairs. But as the two formations curved toward each other, the Japanese pilots began to sense something was off. The American fighters weren't losing altitude. They weren't wallowing or stalling. They were tightening. X. The moment before shock, 0704 hours. The first Corsair swung inside the Zero's turn, exactly the maneuver every Japanese pilot had been told was impossible. Nishida blinked hard, confused. The thick Pacific air favored the Corsair's wing geometry. The massive engine delivered instant thrust. The Marines had trained for this exact scenario. In a single sweeping motion, the Corsair crossed the Zero's circle. Nishida realized what was happening, but by then, the American guns were already heating. What began as another confident Japanese intercept was about to evolve into one of the first major demonstrations of the Corsair's true potential. A turning duel where the Zero no longer held supremacy. 0704 hours. Solomon Sea. The sky snaps into violence. The moment Lieutenant Saburo Nishida commits to the turn, the geometry of the fight shifts. The Zeros arc outward into their familiar, graceful circle. Light, smooth, confident. For 2 years of war, this maneuver had been their signature advantage, the trap from which few American pilots escaped. But not today. The Corsair's inverted gull wings dig into the humid air like the talons of a diving hawk. Its nose slices inside the Zero's arc, an impossibility in the minds of the Japanese pilots, yet happening before their eyes in real time. For a heartbeat, present tense seizes the scene. Marine Lieutenant Harold Mitchell rolls slightly left, yanks back pressure, and feels the aircraft lock into its turn. No buffet, no stall shudder, only pure lift. He mutters into his mask, "She's holding? She's holding. There it is." A Zero flashes across his canopy, too slow to react. Mitchell squeezes the trigger. The 650 caliber guns erupt in a thunderous, vibrating burst. Shell casings rain across the water. The tracers tear through the Zero's starboard wing root. Fuel ignites instantly. The aircraft blooms into a fireball and spirals downward, trailing smoke that cuts a dark line across the blue Pacific. 0704:20. Nishida sees it. The first undeniable proof that the American fighter can not only match but exceed the Zero in a level turn. His mouth goes dry. Instinct screams at him to break away, dive, regain separation. He does not break fast enough. 3 Corsairs pivot simultaneously. One Japanese pilot radios, "The American is inside. Impossible. Inside the turn." His last transmission dissolves in static as another burst of 50 caliber fire shears through his fuselage. Combat geometry collapses. The Zero's core doctrine relied on superiority in horizontal maneuvering. Now, with that advantage shattered, the entire formation finds itself exposed. At low altitude, their once celebrated lightweight frames become vulnerabilities. The Corsair, heavily armored and brutally fast, shrugs off hits that would send a Zero cartwheeling into the sea. 0705. The battle tightens into a violent, swirling knot, no more than 1,000 feet above the water. Every second becomes a test of physics and nerve. A Japanese wingman attempts a climb to escape the Americans' relentless pursuit. But the Corsair's R-2800 engine responds instantly. A Marine pilot pulls up behind him, climbing with ease, climbing with power the Zero cannot match. At 400 feet, He fires a 3-second burst. The Zero disintegrates mid-air. Fragments splash across the ocean like stones thrown from a giant's hand. Nishida's decision point, 07:05:30. Lieutenant Saburo Nishida faces a crisis that would define the engagement. 2 of his men are down. A third trails smoke. The American fighters have turned the battle inside out. For a moment, Nishida fights the urge to flee. But he is a veteran pilot. He knows that panic is death. He steadies his breathing and makes a calculated decision. Dive beneath the Corsairs, force them to overshoot, then climb into their blind spots. It is a desperate strategy, but the only one he has left. He pushes the stick forward. The Zero plunges toward the shimmering ocean surface, its wingtips nearly skimming the waves. Mitchell sees the maneuver and follows, but the dense air favors the Corsair again. The American fighter does not overshoot. It closes. 07:06 hours. Nishida glances over his shoulder. The Corsair is still there, unmoving, locked in position like a predator that has memorized its prey's every escape tactic. He banks hard left. The Corsair stays with him. He banks right. The Corsair remains fixed. He tries a vertical pull, traditionally suicide in a Zero at sea level. But he is out of options. The nose rises. Speed bleeds instantly. Lift falters. The aircraft shudders. The Corsair roars upward after him with terrifying ease. The moment of realization. Inside the Zero's cramped cockpit, Nishida finally understands. This is not the slow, clumsy fighter Japanese intelligence described. This is not the overweight brute that could be outturned at will. This is a machine built for dominance at the very altitude he thought safest. He whispers to himself, "This is not the same airplane." The Corsair closes to firing range. Mitchell exhales steadily and fires. A concentrated burst rips through the Zero's tailplane. The aircraft lurches violently. Smoke fills the canopy. Nishida fights the controls, but the machine no longer responds. Flames crawl along the fuselage. The Zero drops into a shallow dive, then disappears behind a rising column of black smoke. 07:06:45. 3 minutes after the first turn, the outcome is no longer in doubt. The Corsairs have torn apart a formation that once would have owned the fight. Command decisions in real time. With Nishida down, the remaining Japanese pilots face a brutal choice. Climb and be run down. Turn and be outturned. Dive and risk disintegration. Their leader gone, their doctrine shattered. They scatter. The Marine Squadron leader radios calmly. "Break them up. Stay low. Use your flaps." Corsairs pursue the fleeing Zeros across the sea in coordinated pairs. They engage surgically. No frenzy, no waste of ammunition. Years of Japanese air superiority evaporate in minutes. One fleeing Zero attempts to skim the waves at such a low altitude that its propeller tips throw twin white vapor trails behind them. For a few moments, the pilot stays ahead, but the Corsair is faster. At 07:07, an American burst catches the Zero's canopy. The aircraft flips violently into the water, sending a plume of salt spray into the air. The final moments. By 07:08, the sky falls silent again. The surviving Japanese pilot, flying alone, pulls away at maximum speed. He looks back once and sees the bent wing fighters turning calmly toward Bougainville, engines humming steadily. Their silhouettes, strange, ridiculed, unmistakable, glow in the rising sun. For the first time in the war, a Japanese formation has been decisively defeated in a pure turning battle by an American fighter. A fundamental truth has revealed itself in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable. The Corsair's unlikely design had redefined the geometry of air combat. What had begun as laughter in briefing rooms had ended as smoke drifting over the Solomon Sea. Fade in. Archival images of ruined factories, exhausted commanders, and scattered maps. Narrator V.O. The dust from the operation settled slowly, first across the ruined airfields, then through the corridors of power where careers were being quietly buried. What began as a tactical miscalculation had evolved into a chain reaction of political consequences, each more damaging than the last. The immediate military outcome was clear. Losses were heavy, morale was shaken, and the enemy's confidence soared at precisely the moment Allied planners feared a breakthrough. But the deeper wounds were invisible. Fractures in trust, in leadership credibility, and in the perception of who truly understood the direction of the war. The personal cost. In closed-door sessions, senior officers were forced to admit the truth. The operation had exposed weaknesses they had long refused to acknowledge. Some tried to shift blame, others quietly rewrote reports. Careers that had once seemed untouchable now hung by a thread. Among field commanders, disillusionment spread like smoke. They had carried out the orders faithfully, even when those orders defied battlefield logic. Now, they faced the impossible task of rebuilding cohesion while knowing the higher command had gambled with their lives. The political fallout. In the capital, lawmakers and ministers circled the failure like vultures. Some demanded inquiries. Others maneuvered behind the scenes, trading accusations for political leverage. The operation's failure did more than tarnish reputations. It shifted the balance of power. Certain factions, long skeptical of the military strategy, gained new influence. Their rhetoric hardened. If they didn't understand the enemy, how could they claim to understand the war? Meanwhile, foreign observers watched with interest. A single misjudgment, they noted, had altered the tempo of the entire campaign. The enemy's high command recognized the opportunity instantly and exploited it. Strategic consequences. The enemy's counteroffensives grew sharper in the weeks that followed. Intelligence networks, shaken by the earlier miscalculations, struggled to regain their footing. Reinforcements were delayed. Supplies were diverted. And every setback whispered the same uncomfortable truth. One failed operation can reshape a war more profoundly than a dozen victories. Analysts later concluded that had the leadership acted with clearer information or greater humility, the outcome may have shifted dramatically. Instead, overconfidence had blinded them to crucial signals, and rigid political dynamics prevented a course correction when it mattered most. The legacy of the failure. Years after the war, historians would return to the operation, not as a tale of military defeat, but as a case study in leadership under pressure. They dissected every decision, every overlooked warning, every misinterpreted report. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. The operation had failed not because the enemy was superior, but because the leaders guiding it had not listened to their commanders, to their intelligence officers, or to the war itself. The tragedy lay not only in the lives lost, but in the realization that the failure had been avoidable. Narrator V.O. Final note. In the end, the operation's legacy became a lesson etched into the institutional memory of the post-war world. If strategy becomes entangled with ego, and if political survival outweighs operational truth, even the strongest armies can stumble into disaster, fade out,